Hey everyone, this is Bobby Gray. I'm in the HI 304 Civil War class of Professor Boardman, and today I'm going to be giving my presentation on the Second Battle of Fort Wagner. I've entitled it as a kind of a subtitle that we met with a warm reception, and this is from a quote that was actually from a letter that was written by Sergeant James Morrison of the 62nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry, which is one of the 10 primary regiments that assaulted Fort Wagner in this conflict. So basically today we are exploring one of the American Civil War's most influential battles, and I'm going to tell you why I feel like it was one of the most influential battles of the war as we get into it a little bit further. The way we're going to break this presentation down is we're going to start by discussing the need for the construction of Fort Wagner, why it was there, and then kind of go into a little bit of a general prelude to battle. We're going to discuss the units that were most specifically engaged at Fort Wagner during the conflict. We're going to talk about the significance and the courage of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. They were one of actually the lead regiment in this conflict. As any of you guys that have seen the movie Glory are very familiar with that. We're gonna talk about them in great detail, and then we're going to go into the direct events leading up to the battle. We are going to detail the actual assault and battle itself on Fort Wagner. Then we'll go into the battle's outcome and immediate aftermath. And then finally, we're going to finish up with the legacy that the battle had and what its overall historical impact was. You'll see here on this slide a screenshot taken, or an image taken from the movie Glory that depicted Morgan Freeman and Denzel Washington. First off, you have to, when considering this battle, you have to kind of understand the events leading up to it, most specifically the other battles that had occurred early in 1863. So some of the critical battles of early 1863, it was a decisive year in shaping the Civil War's final outcome. There were great momentum swings for both sides of the overall conflict. The Union had seen success in the Western Theater, culminating with the fall of Vicksburg. And the Confederacy had won decisive and emboldening victories at Chancellorsville and Winchester. Chancellorsville, as most of you probably know by now, was General Robert E. Lee's, what a lot of them consider his most strategic and great battle. But subsequently, the Union was then able to inflict a great defeat upon General Robert E. Lee at the Battle of Gettysburg. This was a major victory that occurred July 1st through July 3rd of 1863. So please keep that in context of what we're going to be talking about here. And also keep in mind that the Vicksburg fell right about the same time. So two major Union turning points leading right up to the Second Battle of Fort Wagner. Now the Union, after Gettysburg, had its sights set on striking deep into the heart of the southern states. President Abraham Lincoln and his military commanders wanted to take Charleston, the very place in which the war began. So with that, we're going to talk about the strategic importance of Charleston, South Carolina. First off, it was a very vital Confederate port. Charleston served as a crucial port for the Confederate supplies and trade during the Civil War. The city itself was built on commerce and logistics with its location right there on the ocean in the harbor. With Union control of Charleston and its harbor would eliminate one of the South's primary supply chains. Additionally, it was a symbolic Southern capital. Charleston represented the symbolic heart of the South and its resistance during the war. Its capture would send a signal to the citizens of both the North and the South. Additionally, it was a strategic military target. In addition to the disruption of Southern supply lines, Union leadership also felt that the capture of Charleston would significantly weaken Southern morale. Confederate resolve, reputation, and recruitment would be impacted negatively as a result. Okay, so talking about the construction of Fort Wagner and its role in the coastal defense of Charleston Harbor. Fort Wagner was built on Morris Island, and it's a low elevation barrier island at the southern entrance of Charleston Harbor. It was built by the Confederacy in 1862 to guard the southern entrance to Charleston Harbor. From its position on the bay, it helped to control key access points against any enemy incursions into the harbor. It was considered to be very strong defensive structures, not necessarily because of the materials that it was built of, because it was actually an extensive earthen defenses, and it was created. That actually created a very significant challenge for the Union naval and land forces during any attacks. If you can imagine having a huge fortification built almost entirely out of large mounds of walls of sand and timber and things like that, they actually stood up very, very well against artillery bombardment. One other thing to note is that enslaved American labor was utilized during the fort's construction. And I think that this fact will play kind of a special significance for one specific Union regiment that we've already discussed during the battle itself. Getting into more detail about Fort Wagner, or what it was sometimes called Battery Wagner's utilization in the defense of Charleston Harbor. Charleston Harbor overall had a number of batteries and forts around it to protect the harbor. The most important three here were Fort Moultrie, Fort Sumter, and Fort Wagner. Fort Moultrie is still there today, by the way. I've actually visited it myself. Amazing facility and historical place. I highly recommend you go check it out if you get a chance. I personally haven't been to Fort Sumter yet, even though it was right there, but I do plan to make that trip hopefully very soon. But the three of those forts, along with a multitude of other batteries, which were basically just groupings of artillery, served to protect this harbor very, very well. But the key three installations were Fort Wagner, Fort Sumter, and Fort Moultrie, which is on the north side. And all three, it's important to remember, all three forts remained under Confederate control at the time of the Second Battle of Fort Wagner. Key Confederate forces that were engaged at the Second Battle of Fort Wagner, we're going to break those down a little bit. So first off, the commanding officer for the Department of the South was General P.G.T. Beauregard. I'm sure if you guys have already seen that name many times when in our studies of the different battles, because he was highly engaged in a lot of different theaters of war from the very beginning of the war. At this time, he was over the whole region. Once again, he was the commanding general of the Department of the South, but he was located in the Charleston area. He was not specifically in Fort Wagner at the time of this battle. Although he obviously did make a presence there at the time, he was not the commanding officer on site. So if you see any articles that say he was a commanding general, he was in the region, but he was not the commanding general on site defending Fort Wagner. That commanding officer was actually Brigadier General William B. Taliaferro. Now I had to get myself corrected on this from some research, because it looks like it should be Taliaferro, but it was pronounced Toliver, just like you would say, Toliver. And I'm sure that was maybe one of the formations of the name Toliver or variation. So there was a total of Confederate forces engaged at Fort Wagner during this battle of about 1,800 soldiers. The primary Confederate units defending Fort Wagner were the biggest three were the 31st, 51st, and 61st North Carolina Infantries. Now, I named them specifically because they were their entire unit. They were the primary units there on the infantry side of things that were handling it. There were quite a few other detachments from other units that were there that were a part of it, specifically from Georgia and South Carolina, in addition to North Carolina. That had like a detachment from their primary unit that was sent there, but it was not like in full force. So the largest three forces from my research was the 31st, 51st, and 61st North Carolina Infantries, with support from a whole lot of other detachments, to include a lot of artillery units. So the largest artillery unit there that was manning the the heavy guns of Fort Wagner was the 1st South Carolina Artillery, in coordination with detachments from other units. The other major fighting unit there was the Charleston Battalion. So it was the local militia from Charleston that was also on site at Fort Wagner during this conflict. Additionally, the Fort Wagner defenses were supported and reinforced during the battle by nearby units under the commands of General Johnson Haygood, General Alfred Colquitt, and Colonel Robert F. Graham, of which I believe Colonel Graham's unit was the closest. These forces were chiefly present in defense of Charleston in the event that Fort Wagner and Morris Island were to fall. So if they wanted to be able to stop any further progression towards the city in the event that Fort Wagner and Morris Island in its totality were to fall. So now we're going to get into a deeper discussion about the 54th Massachusetts. So first off, we're going to talk about its formation. With the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of 1863, keep in mind this was just like 7 months prior to this battle, African Americans could now serve in the U.S. military. The 54th Massachusetts was one of the first African American regiments formed during the Civil War, and by May of 1863, it had filled to over 1,000 men. I think at one point they finally even had to decide. They had so many people, men that wanted to join the 54th at this time, that they ended up having to create a second one, which I believe was the 55th Massachusetts, which was another African American regiment that was formed out of this whole recruitment effort. And although formed in Massachusetts, recruits were accepted from all over the North, even the South, and a few even coming from Canada, believe it or not. The leadership structure of the 54th Massachusetts. Now, you got to think about this in context, but it was led by an all-white team of officers with Colonel Robert Gould Shaw as its commanding officer. Couple of schools of thought here. First off, at this time there weren't, I'm sure, a lot of African American officers at all. They had not been in combat. They had not seen training to that degree. So that might obviously had some influence on that. But let's be honest here. A bigger portion of this was the fact that even in the North, there was a sentiment that they weren't quite comfortable with black commanding officers being able to properly guide these troops. So that's part of it behind it. Now, that being said, you'll see that there was some other influences on choosing Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. So let's talk more about the role of African American soldiers in the Union strategy. So at the time, abolitionists and many within the Union command were eager to give African Americans, and in this case the newly organized 54th Massachusetts, an opportunity to prove their capabilities in battle. And it was no coincidence that they were assigned to this specific theater of combat as deep into the South as it was. Keep in mind, what they were looking to do was challenge some social norms of the time. The goal was to demonstrate their preparedness and tenacity in battle. Skilled and effective African American soldiers would defy the prevalent racial prejudices of the day and substantially bolster the North's prospects for victory. Leadership of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. So breaking him down a little bit and kind of explaining why he might have been the officer chosen to lead this unit. He was a line officer, starting off as a lieutenant and then later a staff officer. Earlier in the war, so Robert Gould Shaw fought in the battles of Winchester, Cedar Mountain, Front Royal, and Antietam. He was wounded at both Front Royal and Antietam, so he did have a good bit of combat experience already at this point. Keep in mind, Robert Gould Shaw was actually an abolitionist. His father was a prominent abolitionist in New England, and Shaw echoed these sentiments. He knew his men and regiment were equal to all others, and his soldiers had great respect for him because of this insistence that he had. He was dedicated, so Colonel Shaw's guidance and dedication greatly influenced the 54th Massachusetts confidence, resolve, and morale. His leadership style emphasized strict discipline and order within the regiment. These traits would go on to serve the 54th very well in combat. His fighting spirit, Shaw's commitment inspired a resilient fighting spirit among the soldiers, even when placed under extreme duress. And this was all due to his guidance. Well, let me rephrase that. He set kind of a standard that they followed to a high degree. Okay, now we're going to break down the key Union forces engaged at the Second Battle of Fort Wagner. The commanding officer was a Brigadier General Quincy Gilmore. He had successfully landed troops on the southern portion of Morris Island just prior to this engagement, and so he was preparing for this particular battle. At the time, in this specific battle, there was a total Union forces engaged of about 5,000 men. We're talking specifically in the engagement of at the Second Battle of Fort Wagner. And these were broken down into three primary brigades. There was actually more soldiers present, but these were the only infantry units that got directly engaged in the combat. I'm not getting into the detail about the variety of artillery units and naval artillery units that were involved in the attack. It's just a lot to go over. So I will tell you this, that there was a significant number of different artillery units that were engaged, and we're going to discuss that here in just a minute, that basically bombarded the fort just prior to the land assault, and then also a subsequent siege after the battle. So the three primary brigades that attacked, and they attacked pretty much in the order that I have them listed here, were the Strong's Brigade, Putnam's Brigade, and then kind of held back in reserve was Stevenson's Brigade that did not advance till the very near the end of the battle, when at darkness it basically was over. So they were not significantly engaged, I would say. But Strong's Brigade was led by the 54th Massachusetts with Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, and followed up by the 6th Connecticut, the 48th New York, the 3rd New Hampshire, the 76th Pennsylvania, and the 9th Maine. And then immediately after that, followed in order, was the 7th New Hampshire, the 62nd Ohio, the 67th Ohio, and the 100th New York. And then once again, Stevenson's Brigade came in late, and that was the 10th Connecticut, the 24th Massachusetts, and the 97th Pennsylvania. So I have a little bit of a personal connection to the Battle of Fort Wagner, and I hope to be able to include it here. So my great-great-grandfather was Sergeant James Nelson Gray. He was in two different units during the Civil War, and I'm going to tell you what I know for sure. What I know for sure is I know when he enlisted in each unit and when he got out of each unit, and then I know what battles that those particular units fought in. He's in 1861. He enlisted in the 16th, basically right after the war began. As we've already learned, at the beginning of the war, President Lincoln basically called for a large number of soldiers for only. They thought the war was going to end quickly, so my great-great-grandfather joined the 16th Ohio Volunteer Infantry early on for only a 3-month enlistment, because I guess that's how they thought the war was going to end. So he actually did. His unit was engaged in some minor battles during that time frame, and then after that enlistment ended, they were forming the new 62nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry, and he re-enlisted for a 4-year time frame. During that time frame, they engaged in a number of battles, and as I've already mentioned, they did fight at the Battle of Fort Wagner. I have not been able to get any clear definition that he specifically fought in the battle, but he was assigned to the unit at that time, and he did not get out until after his unit was actually at Appomattox at the when Lee surrendered, and at, I do know that he did not muster out until after the war had ended. So he would have been in the 62nd Ohio at the time of the Battle of Fort Wagner, but I do not have any clear evidence for sure that he participated. And the reason I bring that up is because I know from family history through my father that at some time while he was with the 62nd Ohio, he was shot and injured. So I don't know if this was before, during, or after the Battle of Fort Wagner. So it's possible that he was not there, but it's also very possible that he was there, and it's even possible that he was wounded there because obviously there was a lot of that, and I do know that he was wounded. I just have not been able to get the evidence as to where he was wounded. So some interesting parts about the 62nd Ohio is they actually held a position on the parapet because keep in mind there was approximately what 7 or 8 units ahead of them. I guess that was probably that had assaulted in order, and they basically followed right up in the middle of all that carnage and managed to gain the top of the parapet of the fort and held that position for almost an hour. Never got any relief to come help them, and eventually had to retreat. They later members of the unit described the event as a carnival of terror, and that was because they were basically under direct fire from small arms, from cannon fire, and that cannon fire included canister and grape shot, which is basically like using a cannon as a shotgun. The 62nd Ohio, I want to point to, suffered a 55% casualty rate during the battle. So 55% of the unit was either killed or injured. Okay, now Union artillery prior to the engagement. So this is really important because we talked about the way the fort was constructed and Gilmore's plan was to have the ground assault. But first off, he was to soften the fort's defenses with an intense bombardment in the morning. Naval Commander Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren engaged 11 of his fleet's ships in this artillery. So there was that, and then also the Union had built about 4 ground-based batteries, primarily on other portions of Morris Island, to bombard Fort Wagner leading up to the ground assault. But keep in mind, those fortifications were amazing. They had a bomb-proof, and basically all of the defenders were able to ride out this bombardment in this underground, what they call bomb-proof. So it greatly, their fortifications greatly limited the effects of the bombardment. So, going to give you the specific time frames leading up to this, to the Second Battle of Fort Wagner. And of course, I jumped way ahead and I mentioned that Fort Sumter was fired upon and the Civil War begins in 4/12 of 1861. And I mainly did that because it's literally hundreds of yards away from the site of Fort Wagner. It's just to the north, what would be northwest slightly, and that's where the war began. And the Confederates still held Fort Sumter at the point this war began. So, or this battle began. And 1862 to 1865, Lincoln and Union military leadership greatly desired the capture of Charleston and its harbor. So they never, they had been, they'd had this as a goal pretty much from the beginning of the war. In June of 1863, Brigadier General Gilmore begins preparations for the battle, the capture of Battery Wagner. And then on 7/11 of 1863, Brigadier General Strong leads the first battle of Fort Wagner. It was leads the first attack, so it was considered the first battle of Fort Wagner, but is repelled. I think they probably thought that it would go easier than it did, and they found that Fort Wagner was very, very well constructed and defended. After the first battle of Fort Wagner, rebel reinforcements under General Beauregard arrive in order to bolster the defenses. 7/12 to 7/17, 1863, so this is all the week leading up to that, General Gilmore begins planning that larger ground and sea attack. On 7/17/1863, the 54th Massachusetts is chosen to lead the attack. I do want to make a point out here. That's one of the things that if you watch the movie, it's a little bit changed in order for dramatic effect. Is that in the movie they show the I think Colonel Gould stepping forward as offering to lead the attack. In reality, they were chosen. They were chosen specifically because the Union upper leadership wanted the 54th to have the opportunity to prove their mettle, and also to show the rest of the country that African American troops could fight bravely and effectively in combat. So they were actually chosen for that assault. They did not volunteer per se. On 7/18/63 in the morning, the naval bombardment begins. So pretty much from, I would assume, daybreak all the way up until about 7:45 p.m. The heavy bombardment. So they get pounded, and this entire time, the defenders are in those bomb proofs, just kind of riding it out. As soon as that bombardment ends, the ground attack begins. Once again, I want to point out a little bit about the fort itself. So the Union forces are going to face strong, well-fortified defenses with entrenched troops and artillery positions. So this isn't just a bunch of guys leaning over the sand, firing their muskets. This is a well-defended fortification. And Fort Wagner's well-built bomb-proof allowed the fort's defenders to, as I've already mentioned, ride out that early morning bombardment. And this is very key. The terrain from which the Union forces had to assault from made this assault incredibly difficult. So you have to go across a very narrow stretch of beach, and then you had marshlands over all the rest of it. And this looks like there's plenty of ground here to assault on, and the reality of it is this is all marsh. I mean, you'd be like trudging through a bog to try to attack this fort. So they basically had to assault along the beach area itself. And it actually came down to a really narrow point here, and I'll show you here in just a second. This diagram shows specifically the assault on Fort Wagner and how the 54th had to charge forward as the leading regiment in this assault. You kind of see how the sand portion itself got so thin right before the fort. It was basically you had 600 men of the 54th Massachusetts assaulting along that very narrow strip of beach, and it's only about 180 feet wide. So I think it's, what is that, 60 yards? Yeah, it's 60 yards wide. So you have 600 men trying to crowd through that. The entire time during that assault and the entire battle, they're under heavy fire from small arms and cannon, grape shot, and canister. So once again, imagine a cannon shooting like a shotgun of metal balls and pellets the size of grapes and peas. So the 54th Massachusetts ended up suffering 270 casualties. That's a 40% casualty rate, with 30 killed in battle and 24 more dying from their wounds soon, with a time frame after the battle. So just a brutal combat. Let me take a minute to talk about this, guys. This was just one of the most gory, smaller battles of the war. We'll call it a smaller battle when you compare it to things of the nature of Chancellorsville and Gettysburg and things like that. But for that many troops, keep in mind, this is just the 54th, so you had 600 men, and then 600 men, and then 600 men, and you put that times 10, having to assault through this 60-yard wide spit of sand in order to be able to get to this fort. And the entire time, the fort has guns trained right down on the spot. So it's just a vision of body after body after body, and men running across and forward and falling and trying to find cover, and then getting to the foot of the parapet to climb up it, and all the time they're under heavy fire. So it's just a very, very, very brutal and difficult assault that turned out to be an unattainable victory. This kind of shows you a little bit more detail, that order of assault. Of course, it makes it look like this piece of beach is wider than it is here, but it wasn't. It was more like the original picture I showed you a minute ago. So let's break down the detail in detail the attack. So first off, you had the first wave of the frontal assault of Fort Wagner. We'll call it, the first wave was at the 1st Brigade. That'd be Strong's Brigade. So General Strong's Brigade led the bold attack. The 54th was followed in order by the 6th Connecticut, 48th New York, 3rd New Hampshire, 76th Pennsylvania, and then the 9th Maine. Once again, incredibly difficult assault. All regiments had to squeeze through that 60-yard wide sliver of beach to approach the objective, essentially without any cover. And then the 54th and the other units were able to crest the fort's parapet, but were driven back due to heavy, intense fighting, hand-to-hand fighting. The leadership itself was quite willing to show their mettle and honestly, in many cases, sacrifice themselves. Specifically with Colonel Shaw, upon breaching the parapet himself as he was leading, and he had the standard bearer right there beside him. But as soon as he got up to the top, he lifted his sword and shouted, "Forward, 54th, forward!" And he was almost immediately received 3 mortal wounds to the chest and died immediately. The second wave of the assault was the 2nd Brigade, and it's almost a little bit of a misnomer because it was literally one right after the other. It was just one unit, one regiment following the other. So right after the 9th Maine went, then came Putnam's Brigade with the 7th New Hampshire, the 62nd Ohio, and possibly my great-grandfather, the 67th Ohio, and the 100th New York. Because of all of the battle and carnage that had gone on ahead of these, some of these later units actually had more of an opportunity, because all that other hand-to-hand is still going on, to actually get up to the parapet. And that's, once again, where some of the 62nd and I believe the 67th were able to gain the top of the parapet. Interestingly, when the 100 New York got there and they were trying to get atop the parapet, a unit from the Confederate defenders had kind of outmaneuvered like the 62nd and 67th that were atop the parapet, and in their confusion, as the 100th New York was gaining over, there was a confusion about who was who, and the 100th New York and some of the Confederates were shooting into the 62nd at the same time, not knowing who they were shooting at. So just a brutal battle with a lot of hand-to-hand and close-in combat. Let's see. So that second wave was actually led by Colonel Putnam, and they came forward as I just mentioned. And then both brigades faced just intense resistance from the defenders, making the assault particularly challenging and dangerous. Moving along, so let's talk about the casualties of the battle. The battle caused significant losses for Union forces, including key leadership such as Colonel Shaw. I believe there's some of the units, I want to say it was Strong's brigade, that had like an 80% casualty rate among the unit's officers. So the officers in particular were targeted, I would say, and it was just brutal. So total Union casualties were 1,515, and of that number, 246 were killed, 880 wounded, and 389 were missing or captured. As we talked about the brutality of the assault, in particular, Sergeant James Morrison of Company B, who I started the presentation with his quote. He wrote, to prove the assertion that we met with a warm reception at Wagner's battery on July 18th of July, you only have to look at our list of casualties, which was very extensive. And as I mentioned, the 62nd Ohio had a 55% casualty rate over the course of that battle. Confederate casualties, on the other hand, once again, very well defended site, very skilled fighters. The Confederate defenders suffered only 174 total casualties, with only 36 killed in direct combat. The overall battle outcome was a resounding tactical defeat for the Union. The assault showcased, however, the courage and effectiveness of African American soldiers. The valor and skilled fighting ability of the 54th Massachusetts immediately invalidated long-held racial stereotypes and led to a surge in African American enlistments for the Union Army. Within the 45th Massachusetts was a sergeant by the name of Sergeant William Henry Kearney. Um, his actions during the battle are considered to be the first actions by an African American soldier resulting in being awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. I'm wording it that way for one particular reason. He wasn't the first African American to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. There were soldiers, African American soldiers, that actually got theirs, even like within in the very next year, or maybe even the latter part of 1863. But I think it was 1864 that the first one was awarded. And Sergeant Kearney didn't get his till years and years after the war. In essence, he was the first one to have earned it. He just didn't receive it and wasn't awarded it until quite a bit later. I think my guess is part of the reason for that might have been that the Civil War, the Union in particular, had this. The Union had this particular practice of awarding Medal of Honors during the Civil War to anyone who captured an opposing unit's colors or their flag. So it was basically an immediate Medal of Honor. So that might have been the reason why some got it so much quicker. But I don't know that for a fact. But that's certainly a possibility. But with regards to Sergeant William Kearney in particular, witnessing during the battle, during the assault, witnessing his unit's color bearer being killed by enemy fire right beside him, Sergeant Kearney caught the 54th's color before they were allowed to touch the ground, which is very important. He then proceeded to along with Colonel Gould, Shaw, excuse me, complete the assault to the top of the parapet, and then planted the flag, withstood the fire the entire time. The 54th refused to back away until the entire unit was called back because of the heavy fire, received 2 very serious wounds in the course of maintaining that, and still managed to get the flag back to with its unit. So very, very courageous and very symbolic in his efforts to try to help the 54th achieve their goal. Very, very brave and courageous man, and somebody very worthy of what he was acknowledged for. I'm going to talk a little bit about Sergeant Major Lewis Henry Douglas of the 54th Massachusetts. A lesser-known fact about the Second Battle of Fort Wagner is that 2 of the famous statesmen, Frederick Douglass's sons, fought with the 54th Mass. Private Charles Remond Douglas and Sergeant Major Lewis Henry Douglas, who I believe was played by Denzel Washington in the movie Glory. Sergeant Major Douglas wrote to his future wife just after the battle and stated, "I wish we had 100,000 colored troops. We would put an end to this war." He just felt that confident in their fighting ability. So the conditions of Fort Wagner after the battle. So after all the units were repelled, excuse me, General Gilmore recognized the futility of it and halted it and decided against another frontal assault. So at that time, they decided basically to just bombard it into oblivion. So Fort Wagner went under about a 60-day siege of just constant bombardment. In the Confederate conditions within Fort Wagner during that time there was a lot of sickness and basic supplies were dwindling fast. The most difficult aspect of this post-battle period was the incredible stench of death. Although efforts had been made to bury the deceased soldiers, the constant shelling in the earthen fort just served to unbury them again and again and again. So after 60 days of bombardment, the rebel forces finally just abandoned the fort due to these extreme and unlivable conditions. So on September 7th of 1863, Union forces moved in and occupied Fort Wagner. And from that point forward, they were able to utilize it in attacks against Fort Sumter and Charleston. So some of the strategic implications of the Second Battle of Fort Wagner, and you can see a picture here. This is after the Union forces. This was an actual photograph taken after the Union forces had moved into Fort Wagner. This conflict had only moderate strategic implications since the Union lost the battle, but were still able to occupy the fort only 60 days later. It was certainly a moral victory for the South, in as much as it was an actual victory. But it was a moral victory because it highlighted their skill of defensive combat, and then once again they defeated a force of vastly greater numbers. From a tactical sense, the Union discovered a need for better combat communications and integration. So, as their ground, sea, and artillery elements didn't always communicate very well, and if they had, it would have really helped them in overcoming Fort Wagner's defenses. So, better coordination would have gone a long way. So here, the more important, in my opinion, implications of the Second Battle of Fort Wagner were the social and political impacts. So influence on public perception of African American soldiers. So they were challenging those stereotypes that we already talked about. The battle effectively challenged racist stereotypes about African American soldiers' combat abilities and valor. There was never any, there could no longer be any thought, doubt, or comment that African American soldiers would not perform well and courageously in battle, because the 54th proved that to be not true. And then even to the point that demonstrating distinction. So African American soldiers demonstrated exceptional performance and bravery in the course of the combat during the battle. The 54th Massachusetts themselves were now considered the true standard bearers. This battlefield success of the 54th Mass set a high bar, and it demonstrating that African Americans were up to the challenge during the latter part of the war. Subsequent African American volunteers, I mean, just a horde that came in after this, helped to tip the scale of war in the Union's favor. In recognizing their bravery and heroism even deeper, you can be said that the 54th Massachusetts Regiment displayed extraordinary bravery during the battle, earning it nationwide respect and recognition. And then you've got to consider the impact on military inclusion. Their heroism helped advance the inclusion of African Americans in military ranks and even within society. So, in concluding the Second Battle of Fort Wagner, I want to just give a brief overview here. So, the Second Battle of Fort Wagner, fought on July 18th of 1863, proved to be a pivotal moment in the Civil War, due not so much for its influence on immediate military outcomes, but more for its impact on the social and political landscape of the wartime in the United States. Though the Union assault led by the 54th Massachusetts Infantry and other regiments failed to capture the Confederate stronghold, the battle underscored the tenacity of African American troops, whose bravery under fire shifted national perceptions and boosted support for black enlistment. This surge in recruitment added critical manpower to the Union cause and significantly enhanced the North's prospects for ending the war. Strategically, though the battle's outcome was a defeat for the Union, it eventually led to the fort's abandonment on September 7, 1863. Subsequently, Union forces occupying Fort Wagner were able to exert increased pressure on the defenses of Charleston Harbor, thus threatening a vital Confederate supply line. Therefore, while the conflict itself was a tactical defeat, the Second Battle of Fort Wagner's legacy lies in its role as a catalyst for military perseverance and the emergence of the African American soldier as a feared and highly respected warrior. So, guys, I want to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to have presented to you the details of the Second Battle of Fort Wagner. Thank you very much.